In this video, we're going to talk about the spread of infection. Now, diseases are classified into several categories based on various criteria, including their causes, the transmission, and impact on individuals and populations. So, to begin with, let's talk about infectious disease versus a non-infectious disease. So, infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms such as bacteria and viruses. The microbes are going to be able to be transmitted from person to person or from animal to humans or through environmental sources, but the key characteristic of an infectious disease is that it's caused by a pathogenic microbe, whereas non-infectious diseases are not caused by microorganisms, and they're typically going to result from such factors as genetics, lifestyle, or even environment. Communicable disease. If we say communicable disease, this is a disease that the term is often synonymously used with infectious disease, but it is a term that refers to a disease that can be transmitted from one individual to another, either directly or indirectly. So if it's considered to be direct, if it's a person-to-person transmission, and it's indirect if we are transmitting it from another type of host, air, water, etc., or it might be using a fomite, and the term fomite just means an inanimate object that is transferring the pathogen to a new host. A good example of that, of course, is a pacifier, Kleenex or tissue. Those kinds of things serve as fomites. Now, a contagious disease is a classification of a communicable disease, but it's one that means that the communicable disease is highly transmittable, and it's going to be easily transmitted through direct contact. Now, that occurs with things like influenza and measles, whereas, for instance, believe it or not, Hansen's disease, which you may know as leprosy, is actually not easily transmitted, so it is a weakly communicable disease. Now, if we say something is a non-communicable disease, those are going to refer to non-infectious diseases, so that are not spread through host to host. So often you might see these because they're going to be where a compromised person, somebody who's already ill or whatever, is invaded by their own microbiota, and we discussed that in a previous video, or they've had an accidental contact with the microbe outside of a normal situation. So, classification of diseases into those categories helps the healthcare professionals and researchers understand the nature of the diseases and to help us with strategizing how to prevent their spread, etc. But diseases can also be classified based on their patterns of spread within the body. And this too is good information to use in how to prevent or to treat. So we talk about an infection if it is localized infection, and a localized infection are limited to specific areas or organs in the body. The infection does not spread beyond that site. An example of that would be maybe a simple skin wound infection, or an abscess in a tooth, or a urinary tract infection that remains within the bladder. Whereas a systemic infection are those that have spread throughout the entire body, and they often are going to use the bloodstream for that. So that means that the infectious agent, that microbe, has reached different organs and tissues and now is affecting multiple systems. So sepsis is a good example of that, and that's actually a severe and life-threatening systemic infection. And then there's some viral infections, most recently COVID-19, that have been shown to affect multiple organs in the body when somebody gets that kind of infection. We then have a focal infection, and that's a specific type of infection that originates from a localized infection. So a focal infection is an infection that began at a particular site or focused within the body in that localized area, and then from this point of origin, it spreads to other areas, and it's going to use bloodstream or lymphatic fluids to do that. And so, for instance, an example of a focal infection can be one of which you had a tooth infection or gum disease, and that was the focal infection, but it was left unattended, and so it has now spread to the tonsils and or the sinuses. So understanding that spread is crucial as well for diagnosing and treating diseases. Other terms that we use when we talk about infectious diseases, Mixed infection. A mixed infection is when an infection is caused by an interaction of two or more microbes and that they are simultaneously causing infection. Whereas when you have one infection leading to another, so you have one microbe that comes in and starts and creates its own infection, and then another one takes opportunity of the fact that the body has been weakened from the primary infection, then in those cases we say the first infection is the primary infection, the second microbe infection is the secondary infection. A good example of this is when somebody has HIV and they have that virus in them and it's caused a lot of weakened immune system, and so because of that, streptococcus comes in and pneumonia, and causes pneumonia as an opportunistic pathogen, and so the pneumonia is the secondary infection where the HIV AIDS is the primary infection. So types of transmission are also important to understand, and so there's various modes for which diseases and infections can transmit. So this is going to be your contact transmission, vehicle transmission, and vector transmission. So when we talk about contact transmission involves the direct or indirect physical contact between an infected individual and a suscepted host, and this can be through various routes. So an indirect transmission, that indirect contact transmission, that's when you're going to be using those fomites. And again, remember, fomites are an inanimate object, so doorknobs, Kleenexes, pacifiers. And then there's going to be a direct contact transmission. In that mode, the disease is transmitted through physical touch or close personal contact, so like skin-to-skin contact, which may occur in like an STD. Or person-to-person contact is going to be, or your droplet transmission, that's going to be when you have a spread of a disease through like a respiratory contact, okay, or a spray of respiratory droplets being breathed out by the first individual, being breathed in by the second susceptible person. Then we have the vehicular or vehicle transmission, and vehicle transmission involves the transmission of disease through a contaminated medium or vehicle. The vehicles can be inanimate objects or substances that carry infectious agents. So this is going to be airborne, waterborne, and foodborne. In the airborne transmission, diseases can spread through tiny respiratory droplets, so like tuberculosis. In waterborne transmission, the contaminated water is going to be a vehicle for transmission of diseases. And so it can be where somebody has used the restroom in a local pool or pond or something like that, and the fecal oral contamination, so it goes from the water into somebody's mouth or eyes and causes contamination, such as with like cholera. Foodborne transmission, that's consuming contaminated food that has been undercooked or improperly prepared, and such as with salmonella or E. coli. So then a vector transmission. A vector transmission involves the use of living organisms such as insects and arthropods, and those are intermediates to transmit infectious agents. So, for instance, we have a biological vector transmission, and that is where you have to have the vector is required as part of that transmission pathway. So it's required as part of that life cycle of that microbe, such as what occurs with malaria and the Anopheles mosquitoes. And then we have a mechanical vector, and in those cases, the vector is not required for part of the life cycle, and it's not even required to necessarily come in contact with the host, but it's carrying the pathogen. So think of things like roaches and flies that may go to one area and touch down and get a pathogen on their legs or body, and then come back and touch on something then that you may put in your mouth or something along those lines. So they have been a mechanical, all they did was physically move the pathogen from one area to another and made it readily available for you to then consume. So lots of different terms for how things are transmitted, and the person to person versus is it indirect, etc. All of this is important, and we study it all because it lets us know how to treat diseases, how to prevent spread, how to go about forming strategies. And part of all of that, the reason we look at them is because epidemiologists need this information. Now remember, epidemiology is the study of frequency and distribution of diseases and other factors that are going to be important for us to try to protect the population. So when we look at these things, one of the things that we're going to look for with infectious diseases in particular is how far and how fast does it spread. So if the disease is in a particular population that is known to have that disease but is occurring at a rate faster than normal, then we say it's an endemic. However, if that infectious disease is occurring at a rate that is rapidly growing and it's being found outside of its normal location, then we say it's an epidemic. And when it's an epidemic, it generally will kind of go to surrounding local areas. Now, if it spreads and becomes across continents and things like that, then it can become a pandemic and it's worldwide. Now, our last topic for spread of infections is actually looking at the clinical stages of infection. Now, when we talk about clinical stages of infection, just recognize that this is the process an infection typically goes through in a normal host, and it's going to have several stages, and sometimes there's going to be a little bit of overlap from one to another. But let's look at the 5 stages of clinical infection. So the first is known as the incubation stage, and the incubation stage is that period between the initial exposure to the pathogen, so when the pathogen first enters the body, and the onset of noticeable symptoms. So during this stage, the pathogen is multiplying and establishing itself within the body. The infected person is often not even aware that they have an infection. So the duration of the incubation stage can vary depending on what the pathogen is and the person's health themselves. The prodromal stage, in that stage, the infected person begins to experience mild, non-specific symptoms. So they're often the first signs of illness, okay? And these symptoms can include things like just being tired, having a headache or low-grade fever. But again, they're not specific to a particular infection. The prodromal stage, it should be an early warning sign that an infection is beginning or progressing. Okay, the period of invasion, or the invasion stage, is characterized by the rapid proliferation of the pathogen within the body. So now you're going to start seeing an onset of more specific and severe symptoms. Symptoms in this stage become more pronounced, such as the chills, the fevers, the cough, sore throat. You might have GI symptoms or other organ-specific issues. So at this point, the pathogen has kind of reached a critical mass, and your immune functions are actively fighting off the infection. Then you come to what is known as the period of decline, and during the decline stage, the body's immune response and if you've had any medical treatments, are beginning to effectively control that pathogen. So the symptoms should be gradually subsiding, and the individual should start beginning to feel better as the pathogen is being cleared from the body. Again, the duration of this stage will vary with the severity of the pathogen and if you've had any medications. The convalescent stage is that last period, and it's the period of recovery and restoration of the body's health, okay, to being like the state it was before the disease occurred. So the symptoms have largely resolved themselves, but you may still have some lingering fatigue or weakness. So these are normal, but again, overall should be feeling better. The length of the convalescent stage can vary depending on the severity of the infection. So those are our 5 stages of infection. It is important to note that not all infections progress through these stages in the same way. The duration and the severity of each stage is going to vary depending on the pathogen itself and the individual's immune health and their overall body.